Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marisa Bono. I'm the CEO of Every Texan. Welcome to our legislative debrief. For Every Texan, social justice is in our roots. Our founding story is integral to who we are today and the values that we hold for Texas. The Benedictine Sisters of Boerne founded Every Texan in 1985 as a solution to their experience running a hospital providing healthcare to low-income families in Central Texas. As part of their work, the sisters saw a system that wasn't working for all Texans. They saw a system that perpetuated inequitable access to healthcare for Texans and their families, and they recognized our state's unfortunate legacy in which Black, Brown, and other Texans of color did not have a fair opportunity to prosper in life. So these sisters, like so many other women trailblazers in our great state, decided to take matters into their own hands. The sisters knew that changing the system would mean changing the laws, so they created a public policy advocacy organization to demand that our state officials put people first in their policy making. The sisters knew our state's collective prosperity hinged on ensuring that every Texan had the opportunity to be healthy, well-educated, and financially secure. That was their vision of justice, and it's ours. Like our founders, we believe that social justice requires public policy, and we're proud to carry on their legacy and continue that fight today. Growing up Latina in San Antonio, one of the most socioeconomically segregated cities in the country, I learned pretty early that in Texas, your opportunities depend on what zip code you're born in. My parents grew up poor in Mercedes in the Rio Grande Valley. They were high school sweethearts, and somehow they were the first in their families to go on and earn college degrees. And they also both went on to earn their master's degrees. So in a sense, we skipped a generation of poverty, and I saw firsthand what educational opportunity can mean for a family, especially for families of color in our state. My parents, through their example, our core family values, were constantly measuring success by what we were doing to help others. It's just a core tenet of our values. It's what I'm teaching my son, and on a more personal level, like the sisters, it's a core tenet of my religious faith. As a result, my work professionally has always been mission driven. That's why I pursued civil rights impact litigation as a young attorney at MALDEF. My personal mission since I left law school has been focused on creating equity and more fair opportunities for marginalized communities in our state and our country. And there's no doubt that we are at a critical juncture for that work today. Policy decisions that are made now will impact our families, my son, my community for generations to come. And that's why I'm so proud to be at the helm of this organization. Every Texan is wholly dedicated to advancing equity and opportunity for all Texans of all backgrounds through public policy, and perhaps more importantly, to ensuring that the voices of the communities impacted actually have a seat at the table. When the 87th legislature began, alongside many of our fellow Texans, we had high hopes for a session that would deliver affordable, accessible healthcare coverage in the wake of a pandemic, and a robust public infrastructure plan that wouldn't leave millions of us without water or electricity. Instead, we were met with a session that has been especially grueling and damaging to our future. At a time when Texans needed relief from the dual crises of the crippling COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing fallout from the energy grid failure earlier this year, many of the legislative priorities from the governor and the lieutenant governor focused on voter suppression, censoring and whitewashing school curriculum, and making gun ownership unsafe in our communities. These priorities represented real threats to communities of color, to democracy, and to our collective well-being as a whole. The 87th legislature demonstrated just how uncommitted certain elected officials are to a policy agenda that actually meets the needs of everyday Texans. Now is the time to focus on our state's greatest resource, our people, and pass policies that invest in public education, affordable healthcare, accessible and nourishing food, and good jobs that give every Texan the opportunity to live in dignity. And of course, none of these fundamental pillars of prosperity can happen without a tax and budget system that is just, equitable, and people-centered. Today, you'll have the opportunity to hear from our team on how we've advocated for data-supported public policies while mobilizing tens of thousands of constituents to demand that our elected officials focus on what matters most, you. And I applaud each and every one of you. This session, we've seen an unprecedented number of Texans engage in our democracy in new and innovative ways. Like our founding Benedictine sisters, you recognize there's a problem and you're ready to fix it. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, Luis and Gina, we have a quick trivia question for you. And the first participant to give the correct answer in the chat box will receive a free Every Texan t-shirt. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important discussion on the legislative session and our people-centered approach to a just and equitable Texas, where every Texan thrives. Okay, so we have our first trivia question here. And again, the first participant to give the correct answer in the chat will win an Every Texan t-shirt. The question is, every Texan engaged this number of voters through coordinated advocacy campaigns this legislative session. What is the correct answer? A, 10,000 voters, B, 141,000 voters, and C, 87,000 voters. And we have Amanda in the chat box who will be moderating, and she will state the first participant to respond with the correct answer. Okay, the correct answer is B, 141,000. You got it. Congratulations to Dennis. Every Texan engaged 141,000 voters through coordinated advocacy campaigns this legislative session. We're incredibly proud about that. And we're going to learn more about those efforts and more now. So I'll turn it over to Gina and Luis.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, y'all. I am Gina Chavez with the communications team here at Every Texan. And as you probably know, Texas recently closed its 87th legislative session, and it was unlike any that we've ever seen. Limited access to the Capitol and virtual testimony shaped a session where public input and accountability to constituents were in short supply. I'm here with our Legislative and Policy Director, Luis Figueroa, and we're going to share some important updates coming out of the regular session and our key focuses as we head into the special session, which starts tomorrow. So let's dive in. Hello, Luis. Welcome.
Hey, good afternoon. Good to see you, Gina. Good to see the team. Excited about this.
I know. Well, Luis, let's dive in. We've got a lot of ground to cover. So help us understand the expectations going into session in the middle of a pandemic. What should have been our lawmakers' legislative priorities?
Absolutely. It was a session for the ages. It was definitely tested our abilities to be innovative. Pre-session after the 2019 session and coming out of the pandemic, a lot of people were expecting it to be a very limited session with a couple of government priorities. The focus should have been on healthcare. That was the #1 issue in the pandemic. It was the #1 issue among voters. It has the biggest equity implications for Latino and Black residents of Texas. It also is a big need. Texas, as has been pointed out over and over by our advocates like Ann Dunkelberg, our state continues to lead the nation in the number of uninsured. And so with that, in addition to the post-pandemic economic recovery, we thought that would be the main focus. We also thought there'd be a chance for higher education focus, considering that we had done K through 12 before, and higher education is a continual need in our state, especially for young students and our growing demographic and population there. In reality, we had Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick gave us 31 priorities. Very few had anything to do with education. We did not have any meaningful reduction in the number of bills or issues addressed. Many of them were red meat conservative issues with little to no focus on the post-pandemic recovery or higher education. And thankfully, the House eventually in mid-session did put together a healthcare package, but the Senate had to be dragged into it and waited until the very last moment of the session to really address it. So it was a difficult session. People were scared to enter because of the pandemic. There was a new speaker. We had Winter Storm Uri to start things off. And so it was a challenge, but our advocates and the community found a way to make the issues of our residents and the people of Texas come to light. It was harder than ever it was before, but we're proud of the work that was accomplished on behalf of every Texan.
Well, as you said, the healthcare obviously was on everybody's minds. And so let's dive a little further into kind of what happened with healthcare. As you said, Texas ranks last in health insurance coverage, and that was way before the pandemic. But then during the pandemic, so many more Texans lost their employer-based health coverage. And in addition, you mentioned the House signed on to this coverage expansion bill, but in the end, we didn't necessarily get what we needed. So let's dive a little further into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, last session 2019 was the session of education. We finally got the school finance reform, putting 11.5 billion into our school finance system. This was the session where we were really going to get to work on our healthcare and really make progress on addressing our worst in the nation healthcare coverage. It was a huge issue in the elections. Any type of polling showed that, that voters were looking at healthcare as the issue for the session, especially since so many people, as you mentioned, lost their employer-based healthcare. And so we worked with a broad coalition, and we're really pushing hard for coverage expansion, whether it's Medicaid expansion or other approaches to bring in the 90% federal matching rate for a very small 10% expansion of the budget in the Texas side. Study after study came out. We have 4 different studies talking how it'd be a net benefit to the economy. It would help people of color. It would help children. It would help women. It would help all the constituents that are in desperate need for healthcare coverage. And so what happened? We had a bipartisan bill for the first time. Bills filed by Representative Johnson and Senator Johnson. We affectionately refer to it as the Johnson and Johnson bill. And for the first time ever, we had Republicans and Democrats sign on to the bill. We had 9 Republicans and every single Democrat sign on to the House version of that bill. We had a majority of members in full support, not only willing to vote for it, but to put their name on it. And it never got a hearing. The speaker and the chairman of Human Resources never gave it an opportunity to come up. And the Senate version similarly also never got a hearing. And so we had one more opportunity in the budget to get a coverage expansion approach. It was done by longtime healthcare advocate, Chairman Coleman, who has been a stalwart advocate for healthcare. It was broad. It gave the governor a lot of discretion. It met all the criteria that it has met. And it was an amendment on the budget, and it fell a little bit short. We did get 1 Republican to vote for it. But the rest of the Republicans were pressured by the speaker and the governor to not put it in the budget. They said it needed to come up in the regular legislative process and be vetted to the committee, which of course they didn't allow. So that was really frustrating because that would have really been a game changer for healthcare in Texas. But we circled back. We did not give up, and we moved forward with 2 other pieces of legislation. One that will provide for continuous coverage of children. As you may know, children are often have to go back to get their income check and their eligibility double checked, and we lose children on the Medicaid rolls whenever they have to go through that bureaucratic process. Same for new mothers. We were able to extend coverage for postpartum coverage for 6 months. This is another issue where we had limited coverage for mothers, but it wasn't comprehensive. So these were 2 good victories. It was really hard fought. The Senate really did not move on these bills until the very, very last moment of the session. And we'll hopefully get into a little bit of those stories later on. But I did want to mention those two victories because they were hard fought. And Representative Cortez and Representative Rose in the House, Senator Colcourse and Senator Zaffarini fought for those bills, and they are important victories in our healthcare coverage for Texans.
Indeed. So one of the things you just talked about was the budget, and arguably a budget, approving the budget, is one of the most important jobs of our lawmakers. And so, and as you and I know, the budget is a moral document because it shows what our state values. But it's also been said that this was the least transparent budget session in recent memory. And so help us understand what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the budget is absolutely the moral document. And so what does this say about the morals of our state and what we're prioritizing? Well, first, you know, it starts with transparency. Do we actually know what's in the budget? Do we know what the priorities are going to be? I got to say, it started off on very shaky grounds. There was a bill, House Bill 2021, that was going to let a small number of legislators, you know, basically about 4 legislators and a few others, to decide where all the federal funding was going to come in from, all the federal funding for COVID relief, you know, all those funds that were coming in for education, healthcare, for infrastructure, were going to be decided by a handful of members. Thankfully, the House members pushed back on that proposal and made it clear that they wanted the entire House of Representatives to decide where that federal funding was going to go, whether it be in a special session or however the process will be, likely be in a special session later on. But it also showed, you know, that leadership was willing to make it a backroom deal to decide where this federal funding was going to go. And so I'm glad that that was pushed back. Unfortunately, the budget itself was very slow coming out. Again, the pandemic, things were moving slowly at the beginning part of the session. And at the end, particularly in the Senate, the senators had the least amount of time they've ever had, less than a day, to review this giant budget document and make a vote on it. You know, it results in them having to take the word of, you know, either lobbyists or the author and just assume that everything that they're saying is accurate and that, you know, it says everything that they, you know, propose it to say. So that makes it a very transparent process. I will say that when it came to the actual substance of the budget, there were some, you know, there were some victories and there were some disappointments. The biggest disappointment, of course, is the Medicaid expansion. We had a real opportunity to take advantage of federal funding, of a budget that would have provided for 90% of the funding for an expansion of Medicaid, that would have been flexible and done in a Texas way. Red states all across the nation have been doing it, and we did not take advantage of it. That is a clear sign that we are not prioritizing the health of our state. We had an opportunity to do more for kids. We have seen this pandemic have huge impacts on children of color and low-income disadvantaged children who are, you know, doing this remote learning and are seeing the gaps. We're seeing gap inequities in education. We could have done more for education. We mainly largely held status quo on those two issues. And we were really concerned going into session about higher education. Traditionally, in a low budget year, it's the place where legislators, especially in Texas, have cut. But we raised the alarm early and often, and we were able to maintain financial aid funding at the same levels, including growth for our students of color and our low-income students that need financial aid. So that was a nice victory. We obviously need to do a lot more. We're still not funding 100% of the need. But going into the session where expectations where cuts were going to happen, we were able to rally our advocates and the people and make sure that we did not leave more kids behind when it comes to higher education. So that's kind of where we are in the budget. We'll see what happens with the federal funding in the special session, and there are some budget issues in this upcoming special session.
All right. And I know we don't have a ton more time, but we've got a little bit more ground to cover. So we definitely have to talk about the connections between social justice and tax policy. Help us understand what happened with tax policy.
Absolutely. So this was another really great victory. We went into session knowing that we have traditionally given these tax abatements to corporations that aren't paying their school taxes. It needed to be reauthorized this session. There was expectations they would get reauthorized and they would get more goodies in their sweetheart deals, and they get it extended for 10 years. We've launched a campaign and pushed hard against that. And the bill got watered down to 2-year extension after it came out of the House. We went into the Senate and we pushed even harder. And at the end of it, we were able to defeat the legislation. It was not reauthorized, and Chapter 313 will not be extended past the end of next year. This is a huge victory for social justice. It means that everyone has to pay their fair share. It means that we are no longer going to just quietly allow for corporations to just continue to get these deals while the residents of Texas and low income continue to have to pay the vast majority of taxes, particularly when it comes to school taxes. So that was a huge victory. We're super excited about that. I think it's a sign that when we put attention on issue and highlight it and put sunshine on it, that we can really make a big difference in our advocacy for social justice and tax policy. I just have to say one thing at the end of the committee hearing. The chair of the committee, Senator Birdwell, who is the author of the bill, said, "Do we need to continue this pain of Chapter 313?" We went from a session where they thought they're going to extend it for 10 years and add more goodies to it to, do we need to continue this pain? We completely changed the narrative on this issue. And thank you to everyone who took actions in our campaign on this issue.
Thank you. Yes, that's obviously such a huge win, and we needed it this year. So thank you so much for all the work. Um, let's talk a little bit. We obviously were just talking about schools. Parents, students, and teachers alike felt the pain of remote learning. Testing results have shown that in these increasing disparities between students of color and white students. So let's dive in a little bit to what was done during the session, if anything, to address student learning gaps and what's happening with federal funding for schools.
Yeah, so one thing we had to push really hard for was to get the federal funding released. There was, the legislators and the leadership was trying to hold on to the money, saying, "Oh, we needed more guidance. They don't need the money right now. We'll see." And thankfully, teachers, administrators, parents, students all rallied and said, "We need this money released to our schools." They're making their budgets right now to determine whether or not they're going to have the funding for their next upcoming school year. And they need to know what their budget's going to look like. And so because of that advocacy, they did release partial funding for schools, the federal funding. That was a big win. The other big win was what's called this hold harmless, which means that that schools would not be punished for the loss of enrollment that kids have been lost during the pandemic. That we'll be able to keep that funding, and hopefully the schools will be able to bring those kids back into the fold when we start the next school year. So those were a couple of solid victories. We need to do so much more. We saw in the testing results that we're having huge, we're seeing the return of huge equity gaps between the students who are low income, who are remote learning, who weren't getting the supports that they were needing at school. It's going to take double the amount of effort to get those kids back into the fold when school starts. And so what that means, it means more tutoring, means more after school programs, it means more technology, it means all these things that require funding and resources. So hopefully we'll get back to that when we release the rest of the federal funding, and that the state won't try to do this supplanting versus supplementing issue where they try to say, well, we're going to reduce the money on this hand and replace it with federal money on this other hand, and they just end up kind of staying even instead of actually getting the extra funds they need to address the equity gaps. So that'll be something we'll see in the special session with the release of the federal funding.
Well, and before we dive into the special session, I just wanted to see if there's any other, kind of highlights or lowlights that you wanted to mention about regular session that positively or negatively impacted Texans.
Yeah, it was an exciting session for sure. It was a very difficult session. There was no question that the priorities of the leadership were focused on issues that don't help the average Texan, whether we're talking about voter suppression or taking away reproductive rights or proliferation of guns. These are things that are not going to help the average Texan address their education needs, their healthcare needs, pay their bills, their unemployment issues. Those are the issues we would have liked for the legislature to really prioritize. With that said, we did get some victories for healthcare, for the mothers, for the children. We were able to, address some tax equity with the reauthorization, the denial of the reauthorization of Chapter 313. But it took a lot of work. And at the end of the last day of the Senate to pass bills, Senator Colcourse had two bills, one that was going to address the continuous coverage for children and one that was going to address the mothers. It didn't have to come to the last day of the session. The lieutenant governor held on to that bill till the very end. Senator Colcourse wasn't even the author of the bill when the session started. It was Zaffarini, and we hit the midnight deadline, and we thought we were going to be unable to get it through. But the Senate kept going, because the thing about the rules in the Senate is if nobody calls them on it, they just keep going. So we got to 3 a.m., we got to 4 a.m., and eventually we got to the bill that was going to address continuous coverage for mothers, the 6-month extension. And we thought we were not going to be able to get the bill done for the children. But the speaker came through with Representative Joe Moody and Representative Frank, and they put it in a conference committee and they added it in and made it a priority. And so we got to call out the leaders when they do good, and they did good on this one and making sure the children were covered. They had to overcome the obstacles of the Senate, the lieutenant governor, and they don't do it just because it's a good idea. They did it because we pushed for it, because advocates that are out there pushed for it, and because it was a priority for Texans. And so because of that, I got to give, a props to our comms team, to our campaign team, for continuing that relentless, pressure to do the right thing for kids. So I wanted to highlight that before we end off and start talking about special session.
All right. Well, let's dive into special session. We only have a few more minutes left. So it starts tomorrow, and after 140 days and over 3,000 bills and resolutions passed in the regular session, can you help us understand why legislators are coming back to do more? What are we expecting to see?
Yeah, no, it's very frustrating to come back. I don't mind coming back for special session if we were going to do Medicaid expansion, or we were going to address the the STAR results that showed the inequities of education, or we were going to address unemployment insurance. But these are not the things that made the call, unfortunately. We just, hot off the presses, we just got about an hour and a half ago, maybe about 2 hours ago, the issues that will be on the call. And as you might expect, there are issues that are very conservative in nature. Voter suppression made the list. Bail reform made the list. Attacks on critical race theory made the list. There's some budget issues. The number one budget issue is refunding the legislative branch of government. The governor vetoed the entire legislative branch of government, their budget. We're not sure that's constitutional now. That's working its way through the courts. But at the end of the day, it means that if we're going to have a special session on redistricting, and if we're going to have a regular session in 2023, they need to refund the legislative branch, because you cannot have a session without staff, without the parliamentarians, without all the people who makes the session work. So that has got to be a priority. And so there were a few other issues that made the thing. We don't have time to cover them all, but I think it's a sign that unfortunately, that we are not where we need to be when it comes to social justice, when putting the needs of Texans first. We are still focused on primary voters in one party, and we still have a lot of work to do.
All right. Well, you talked about voter suppression. Texas has historically ranked very low in voter turnout. So Secretary of State Ruth Hughes said the 2020 elections went smoothly. Why? Can you just help us understand, why is an election bill that makes it harder for people to vote being prioritized?
Yeah, and that's the real frustrating part, because our own Secretary of State, who ran the election, said it went smoothly. Obviously, Republicans won statewide. There wasn't a change in the House of Representatives. It was very consistent with previous elections. No evidence of real fraud. So why are we coming back? Well, the answer is, of course, that the leaders are scared of the electorate, right? They're scared of turnout. They're scared of new voters coming out and changing leadership. And they're scared of the new demographics of Texas. The Latinos and African Americans are coming out in large numbers, particularly in the urban areas. We have seen cities like Houston, Dallas, increasingly Fort Worth, start to shift in their demographics and in their electoral challenges. And so we're unfortunately, they're making efforts to make it harder to vote, adding more bureaucracies, adding more efforts by poll watchers, reducing times for early voting. all sorts of things to just make it a little bit harder to vote, make it a little bit harder to have a completely fair and open election. And that's really unfortunate because that is the core of our democracy at stake here. So we'll see what happens in the special, whether they start from where they ended or whether there is an effort to really hear from stakeholders, really hear from the community. I am excited that in this special session, we'll have more community input. Advocates will be able to, as more people get vaccinated, will be able to enter the Capitol and make their voices heard. And so maybe that'll have an impact on what what actually ends up getting passed at the end of the day.
Well, so we're about out of time, but I wonder if you just might wrap us up and, what policies would build Texas collective prosperity? We've kind of alluded to some of these things, but what is it that Texas really needs? And we'll talk a little bit later about how folks can be engaged in the special session.
Absolutely. So, we are a budget and tax organization. So I will start there. If we could, provide for more equity in our tax policy so that we're not upside down where the lowest income are paying the highest percentage of their income on taxes, we would, make a huge difference in equitable outcomes. If we had a robust unemployment insurance, if we had benefits for workers that, would allow them to take the time that they need when they're sick, when their children are sick, that would make a huge difference for Texans. But I think, what I want to end on is voting rights. We have a state that has traditionally had one of the lowest voter turnout rates. We've always been, in the bottom 15 part of states in terms of voter turnout. If we did same-day voter registration or even electronic voter registration where, you don't have to fill out a piece of paper, you could do it online just like we do everything else, that could make a huge difference in allowing for more people to vote and allowing for a more representative democracy. And that's at the core of it, right? If you have representative democracy, they are representing the communities of color all across the state and their voices are heard in the legislature. The rest of it will fall in line. And so that's the ultimate game, is to have a democracy that's listening to, as we say, every Texan.
I love it. Thank you so much, Luis, for sharing your deep expertise, for leading our team this session in a very tough session and some hard fought ones. We are humbled every day, inspired by all the Texans who take action and commit to building a just and equitable Texas. So before we resume the rest of our program, we have one more trivia question for y'all and a lucky winner of an Every Texan t-shirt. All right, y'all. Are y'all seeing this? The legislative session and the media and press cited Every Texan's analysis this number of times. Who's got it? Who's got it? Oh, it looks like we have a winner. Naomi Miller. She got the correct answer, 312. We had a fair amount of press sightings for Every Texan and can't thank y'all enough. Congrats, Naomi. All right, y'all. And as we transition to the next part, I think we've got some good chats going on to stay updated for our special session updates. And there's some good links in the chat, so check those out.
Thank you for that, Gina. And before we continue, just move on to our next discussion, wanted to share some great news. If you haven't heard it by now, we are proud to announce the 2021 Every Texan Legacy Award recipient, Ford Foundation President, Darren Walker. Darren Walker embodies changing a system in order to achieve shared prosperity and broader equity. And he's a Texan. He grew up in Texas and he cares deeply for our state's future and our potential. The Every Texan Legacy Award is our annual fundraiser and provides vital general operating support for our critical work at the Texas Capitol and across the state. We simply cannot advance just and equitable public policy solutions and provide all of this incredible expertise without funding. With your Legacy 2021 sponsorship, you'll receive access to a virtual award ceremony on September 20th and a scaled down in-person cocktail reception on October 5th. We're incredibly grateful to the individuals, companies, organizations that continue to join us annually in honoring a remarkable individual committed to building a just and equitable Texas. So we're thrilled about this announcement. We can't wait to see you at our event this year, and I'll turn it over now to Mia Ibarra, our Deputy Legislative and Policy Director, and Katie Martin-Lightfoot, our Community Engagement Coordinator, to walk us through Every Texan's efforts to advance public policy solutions using digital advocacy and community engagement, because our work doesn't mean a whole lot if we don't ensure that the communities that are impacted are sitting with us at the table.
Great, thank you, Marisa. Wanted to check, I think we had a poll set up for this section. Are we able to get that up? If so, I'd love to just get a sense of how all of you have engaging with the legislature this year. We're really excited to share more about the community engagement and campaign work that we've been doing. We believe that to build a state where every Texan can thrive, the people who are most impacted by the social and economic injustices in our state have to be front and center in helping to develop and advocate for policy solutions. For most Texans, as Luis alluded to, this session really presented a lot more barriers to understanding and participating in the legislative process and democracy in general at the Capitol. So I'm not sure if we have our PowerPoint deck. Danny, if you're able to get that up. But Katie is going to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that we had this session and our response as an organization.
Thanks, Mia. As my colleagues have shared, the 87th Legislature presented unprecedented challenges for Texans to safely and equitably access the Capitol this year, from COVID-19 and safety precautions and the lack of transparency in the process, and just varying legislative procedures made it really, really difficult for Texans to safely access the Capitol. Today, Mia and I are going to share a little bit more about how Every Texan responded in innovative ways to amplify the voices of Texans from across the state. We're hopeful that the successes that we experience this session will continue to strengthen our advocacy and engagement work in the future.
Great. You want to take us to the next slide, Danny? So I'm Mia Ibarra. I use she, her pronouns, and I've been with Every Texan for almost a decade. My role now is Deputy Legislative and Policy Director, and what I do is really to help coordinate our external strategy work and our outside game campaigns. It's been really rewarding over the past several sessions to see our advocacy work evolve and expand, and we've really built our muscle to engage voters in the work that we're doing so that we're building power and raising voices outside the Capitol so that we can fight for change more effectively inside the ledge. With the voices of so many Texans left out of the process, both our electoral process and the policy process, we're really passionate about building campaigns that mobilize Texans from Laredo to Lufkin around people-centered policies that help all of us fulfill our potential. I'm going to turn over to Katie to introduce herself and just give you a sense of the scope of how our advocacy campaigns are interacting with the relationships that we're developing in communities.
Thanks, Mia. My name is Katie Martin-Lightfoot. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at Every Texan. I have been with Every Texan since 2019 when I was brought on to lead our statewide 2020 census campaign. Through that work, we engaged hundreds of diverse Texans, literally in every corner of our state, to ensure a complete and accurate count for Texas. This was a really big step for our organization, as this was one of our largest engagement efforts to date. We saw firsthand the power of Texans coming together and advocating for an important cause. At Every Texan, we know that policy impacts people, and all Texans have a right to participate in the policymaking process, especially when policy is directly impacting them, their families, and communities. This session, it was so important to center and amplify the voices of people who have direct experience with the policy issues that Every Texan fights for at the Texas State Legislature. On the next slide, we're going to dig a little bit more into Every Texan's advocacy and engagement work this past session.
Great, thank you. I think this session, as you can see from the numbers, some of which we've shared previously through the quizzes, this session set a really wildly improved baseline for our organization, for our advocacy campaigns and voter engagement, and helped us deepen our relationships with community partners across the state. Let's stay on, yeah, thank you. So we engaged over 140,000 voters in 160 counties, over 160 counties across our issue campaign. So we had about half a dozen primary issue campaigns. The main goal or strategies of our outside game campaigns are really to mobilize Texans to take action. So during the session, this meant we did a lot of phone banking to encourage Texans to call their legislators. So we had, for example, on the Chapter 313 campaign that Luis mentioned, Fund Our Future, we had over 1,300 Texans who called their state reps and senators and asked that their legislators ensure that corporations pay their fair share to our schools. And some of these campaigns were in coordination with our partners, and I think what really is a value add for our organization, since we are not, as many of you know on the call, we're not a membership-based organization, but we do have and have increasingly developed the capacity to do voter engagement in areas where our grassroots partners maybe don't have a lot of boots on the ground or haven't developed strong advocacy bases. So we can come in and provide some capacity to do phone banking and other work in those areas where we know our issues are still important to people, even if there's not a large civic engagement group there to mobilize them. I'm going to hand it over to Katie to talk about one of the metrics we have on here is video messages recorded by Texans. This is just one example of how we had to get kind of creative this session, since it was so hard to access the legislature when it comes to raising the voices of Texans and making sure that we were bringing those community voices into the Capitol.
Thanks, Mia. And just like Mia said, we really wanted to focus on Texans. We really wanted Texans to have a space to where they could share their stories and their voices on policy issues that are impacting them and their families. So we utilized a very cool tool called Soapbox, and it's basically just an online platform that allows folks to record video testimony for causes they really care about. It's just a really quick and easy way that Texans can share their stories and have their voices amplified across social media. Every Texan utilized this platform so Texans could share their stories on Medicaid expansion, higher education funding, conditional driver's permits, food security, and more. If you check out, we'll pop it in the chat box and on Facebook, but check out our Soapbox page, because we have a lot of really thoughtful testimony from Texans from across the state. And the other one quick thing that I do want to highlight that was a really powerful moment during this legislative session is that Every Texan, along with our partners at the RETA Coalition, Coalition hosted a hybrid advocacy day to raise awareness on expanding access to driver's permits. With this event, we wanted to make sure it was safe. And so we had it at the Capitol. And one thing with this particular issue is that we didn't get a hearing. So we held a people's hearing. We had folks from across the state of Texas come to the Texas State Capitol. We took over a House committee room and we held a people's hearing. We had testimony from folks in English and Spanish sharing why it is so important for them and their families and communities to have access to conditional driver's permits. And y'all, this was powerful. We had over 2 hours of testimony coupled with soapbox videos, and this reached hundreds of folks via Facebook because we broadcasted everything live. I hope you can tell that I'm really excited about the upcoming work that we are doing with engagement, advocacy campaigns, and outreach at Every Texan. And so I hope that you will continue following along with us as we share out just about how we are engaging folks across the state of Texas. And with that, I am now going to turn it back over to Marisa Bono. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie and Mia. And if you can't tell by now, everyone who's watching right now, our team really leaves it on the line every single day. And we're getting ready to go back into battle this week with the special session to, if you're loving this insider info that you're getting as part of this session, be sure to go to the link in the chat and on Facebook Live. You can get updates through our newsletter and sign up for more information like this on a regular basis. So we're incredibly grateful that you took the time to join us today for this important discussion on the 87th Texas Legislature and the special session, which starts tomorrow. As we look forward, we're reminded of Texans' commitment to our state and to our people. I'd like to take this opportunity to join you to invite you to join us to advance equity and opportunity for Texans of all backgrounds by joining the collective with Every Texan. Members of the collective believe in people-driven public policies and work together to build a state where every Texan can thrive. Our members enjoy exclusive print newsletters as well as invitations to policy expert briefings like this one and other special events. And you can follow the link at this slide to join the collective. But please do join us, and together we'll build a just and equitable future for Texas together. We're excited to offer an exclusive Q&A session to our many friends and supporters. So we'll now be closing our Facebook Live program and transition into the Q&A. So again, please consider joining that monthly sustainer program, the collective with Every Texan, to gain access to opportunities like this one in the future. We're grateful to everyone for participating in our briefing today, and we hope that you found it informative. So we'll see you next time. Thanks again. Adelante.
Hi, everyone. So this is the section of the program where we can do a Q&A. And just feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself and put your video on to ask a question and dialogue with Luis and Marisa about the information that you just heard.
Great.
One quick-
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to communicate that one question we had received at registration was how we see our campaign and community engagement work growing for the future and interfacing with our policy expertise to build a just and equitable Texas.
Before I get into kind of the specifics, I know Marisa has, strong feelings about this. I want to let her kind of give her, kind of big picture vision for that.
Yeah, for decades, and I know many of the people in this session are very familiar with this struggle, but for decades in the social justice and civil rights community, we've often expressed frustration about lawmakers making decisions without consulting and strategizing and working with the communities that are going to be most heavily impacted by the policies that they're making. And so as an organization, it's critical that we not follow in those footsteps. It's critical that as we craft data-driven policy solutions, that we work closely with the communities that are most heavily impacted, that we're constantly seeking input, that we're constantly collaborating and working closely together side by side. That's what really gives the heart and the meaning to our work. And I think you can probably tell by this session and through some of the other briefings that we've had that Mia and Katie have really been spearheading this work, and a lot of the success that we've seen in the most recent legislative session. We did have, as you heard, we did have some big victories despite some tremendous obstacles. And that's because over in recent years, the work of these women and the Every Texan team has created a foundation that we're really starting to build on and are looking forward to expand in the future.
From a campaign perspective, I think, and an engagement perspective, but I'm gonna let Katie talk more about that. I think something that that COVID really pushed us into was doing, we had already been very digitally focused for our campaigns. I think COVID made us even more digitally focused, which I think is great. We started using a lot more tools and strategies, things that we hadn't previously done, branching away from just doing, Facebook ads, so that we're doing a lot more mobile focused work. But I think even that has limitations, and we don't want to leave out Texans who are not either digitally savvy or who do not have access to broadband, which is a huge issue in Texas. So I think something that we're interested in is figuring out new ways to engage, and also that go back to kind of reintegrate the direct one-on-one organizing tactics that we know and love from the pre-COVID days, while still being able to, work at scale. Since we're a small shop, we don't have offices all over the state. So trying to find, what strategies allow us to really build power, but, still have relationships in communities, build relationships with supporters long-term, and do that work at a scale that makes an impact in a state like Texas. Katie, anything else you want to add?
I'll say that Marisa and Mia did a wonderful job kind of explaining what our thoughts are looking forward with our campaign and engagement work. One thing that I do want to also pull out is thinking about rural Texas. I know a lot of our work is oftentimes in more urban spaces, and at Every Texan, we're thinking about ways of how can we really engage folks in rural spaces across our state, especially when we think about minority communities that are in those areas too, and just thinking about how do we engage with them? How do we get them involved in the policymaking process? And engage with the policies that we advocate for, and making sure, of course, that we're kind of having that feedback loop between understanding what the community's needs are as well. So like I alluded to, there's a lot of really exciting things happening right now at Every Texan, and we are so excited in the next upcoming months to kind of share out a little bit more what our advocacy campaign and engagement strategy is going to look like moving forward. So stay tuned.
One, a side conversation we've been having, but definitely related, is how to make our coalition work and our messaging more accessible. So some of you may have noticed, for example, that our session today was closed captioned, recognizing that we want Texans of all backgrounds to be able to participate in our public work and to receive the information we're putting out. We put the calls for the 1115 waivers, for example, those we provided those in Spanish for our regular viewership, and then also some of our partners, so that they could use those for their memberships. And so thinking about how to integrate multilingual materials and how to make our materials more handicap accessible, that's an important part of the strategic work as well.
Last call on questions. Thank you everyone for being here today. We so appreciate your time and support. It's absolutely our donors and partners that are in the trenches with us, advancing people-centered public policy, and we're exceedingly grateful for your continued support.
And we're always available through direct messaging as well, and through email. But if we don't have any further questions, we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.